Kia ora everyone and welcome back. Welcome to this afternoon's session. I hope you enjoyed this morning's session. At the end of the morning, Claire summarised the key themes and messages. And I guess for me, one key message or one takeout that I had from the various panels and sessions that we had was that for us to reach our potential and indeed address the challenges we have, our current approach will not cut it. So we have to do things differently. We have to consider and adopt different approaches and most importantly, implement those. So this afternoon's sessions takes us right into that area and it continues to set the scene with what the future looks like being a key theme and how New Zealand might leverage its strategic advantage. We'll hear from Futurist Francis Valintine and about demographic change and meeting future challenges from distinguished Professor Emeritus Paul Spoonley, before a panel discussion reflecting on social outcomes, I beg your pardon. And I guess if we think the future is somewhere we don't need to inhabit, I heard someone yesterday tell me that 2050 is as close as 1990 is today. So let's just keep that in context. The future is closer than we think. So to get us underway, it's my pleasure to introduce Noriko Wynn. Noriko heads the Future Research Area in Aurecon's Futurist team. This is a dedicated service helping clients use strategic foresight to navigate uncertain futures and anticipate new opportunities for innovation, products and services. As Futures Research Leader, Noriko works with clients using strategic mapping, systems thinking, and technology foresight to help clients develop situational awareness to anticipate future operating environments. She draws on strategic thinking and foresight capabilities to help clients navigate complexity and ambiguity and deliver innovative solutions. An experienced facilitator, Noriko has a background in economic development, innovation, digital strategy, and public policy. She joined Aurecon from the public sector, where she worked at the highest level of 2 Australian state governments, specialising in economic development, innovation, policy, digital economy, investment attraction, defence, and precinct development. Welcome, Noriko, and over to you.
Kia ora. Thank you for having me. I'm coming to you from Melbourne, from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people in Melbourne. As a sponsor for this conference, it's my privilege to share a little bit about how Aurecon is thinking about the future before we get to the main event for this session. One of the key things we consider here at Aurecon, and by using the principle for the future, is considering that change has a direction and a rate. And in order to understand what we might need to adjust to, we need to think about how fast that change is coming and from what direction. Some of the things that we're seeing across all businesses or countries or industries is that the half-life of knowledge is decreasing. What we know to be true is changing all the time because we have more and more information about it. Another really interesting thing that we're paying attention to, half-life of skills is decreasing. What it means to generate new skills and what it means to be able to help respond to economies and industries and organizations that are facing multiple transitions. All in all, this means not only do we need to transform fast, but also accelerate the changes we need to make. What we're seeing as we move deeper into this century is coming from us from multiple directions. Climate change, decarbonisation, digitalisation, social shifts. Whereas previous generations might have only had to deal with 1 or 2 significant changes, we're facing multiple interacting shifts in our economy, environment, and social systems. At Aurecon, we take these challenges and are energized by them. We're considering how these rates of on infrastructure, where these vectors of disruption are influencing who uses it, how it's used, and how it might needs to transition as we move into these new worlds of work and these new environments that we are creating around us. We're constantly, as a business, seeking to identify and respond to new technologies, to experiment, in some cases fail quickly, which is at the crux of learning, so then we can go boldly forth with what works. We can figure out how to take some of these shifts in the environment around us and apply these new technologies in order to achieve more efficient outcomes, or in some cases, create new value. For example, in New Zealand, we have been experimenting with a range of different tools and techniques in how we do business, um, and how we help our clients adjust to this changing world. For example, we've used drones and new spatial scanning techniques as part of the Kaikoura earthquake recovery project to understand how we rebuild and what needs to be rebuilt. On the Trentham to Upper Hutt project, we worked with Kiwi Rail digital model for the duplication of the rail line, a project which is now winning awards. And then we look at how we can engage differently with the community and how we can use new tools like virtual reality to help the community understand what might change around them and how new infrastructure is going to impact how they live and how they work and the decisions that they might need to make. In tools and how we design for things like the Puahine Interchange Project and the Manawatu Gorge. And then when we consider one of the really defining challenges for the next century and how we respond to climate change, we're really exploring about how we can use sustainability technologies, how we can redesign for things that allow us to create infrastructure that and can respond and adapt to a changing climate around us. But while there's an understandable focus on technology, and we are an engineering company, we know that it can't be just the focus of what we do and how we do it. That when we employ new technologies, when we consider their impact in the community and on infrastructure, it's critical to consider people and process. Too often, when we think about technology and for the technologists around us, we singly focus on what the technology can and can't do, when increasingly we need to focus on how people interact with that technology. How are they going to use it? And then how does it then get reshaped? We can't just have a technology led future, but we need to consider how it can be technology enabled future approach to how we implement and address these challenges. We know we need to put people at the center, and that it is people and how we adopt, transform, and start taking different approaches that will really let us get ahead and build the futures that we want. It will be people who install, implement, and use these technologies that are defining. But we really need to understand the how we want these technologies to be used and not let the technologies use us, which is really a focus of how we work on these projects and with these new tools in Aurecon, is to take a human-centered approach. Now, this has created the perfect segue and will allow me to introduce why you're here. Someone who deeply understands the changes we need to make and the skills that our leaders, teachers, and workforces need to learn is Frances Valentine. Frances has dedicated her career to education. She has had an impressive career. Her CV is honestly just awe-inspiring. And she's been recognised for her commitment to build a stronger and more resilient through the awarding of the Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. As an education futurist, she has clarity on the challenges and opportunities that we need to address if we want to achieve something different and create that resilient future. But what is really interesting is the work that she's doing not only to anticipate and understand what might happen, but to prepare New Zealand for the changes that are coming. She's taking action to create something new and to prepare the country for how it might need to respond to the incoming changes around technologies like IoT, big data, and automation. Identifying the need to rapidly educate in a different way, she started MindLab in 2013, initially, but then realizing that teachers are the ones who will be shepherding the next generations through these shifts to prepare the next workforce and the next economy and communities. And then in 2016, she started Tech Futures Lab to help businesses prepare and leaders to understand and respond to how technology is shifting in the business environment. But instead of talking about Frances from her, I would like to add before she starts her talk that we will be having a Q&A with Frances after her presentation. So please use the question function if there's anything you would like to ask her, and we will get to that once she's had her talk.
Thanks so much, Lukito. It's so thrilled to be here. Tēnā koutou katoa. And as mentioned, I'm Frances Valentine, and this is just such an important conversation to be having, and I'm just thrilled to be part of this discussion around New Zealand's future, particularly around infrastructure, which I'm particularly passionate about. What I want to start off by talking about is our own ability to understand change. Because once we're deeply immersed in our sectors and our industries, it becomes incredibly difficult to understand what happens at the margins or in the convergent space for people and organizations who are at the frontier of change. And so one of the things in my work and the team of people around me is we focus on the capability building, the knowledge that we need for the future, and actually make sure that if you look at the trajectory of where the world is going, particularly within your sector, how do you get from where you are today to the point where you know you need to be? And so one of the focus areas is looking at why is it we hold on to outdated knowledge? And so the idea where we become very familiar, we've spent a lot of time investing in ourselves and what we have earned, the stripes we have because of our history and experience. But unfortunately, as we moved out of analog into digital, and as we're now moving further into the technological era, we really do need to understand what holds us back from committing to learning and education. Now, the part of this is this idea of salience. And salience is this availability heuristic. And when we think about cognitive biases, often we think about the things that we carry from life. But actually, in this particular situation, is if you look right now at the future events, we look at the things around us right now that are really impacting on us. The obvious is COVID, sustainability. We've had some really extreme weather events. Parts of New Zealand, we've had droughts like here in Tamaki Makaurau. And so we start to imagine that's what the future looks like. Some of those events been exacerbated or exaggerated further. But actually what we miss is actually some of the other types of technological or societal shifts, or even at a humanity level, that are actually occurring, which are driving the way we work and think and shape our future in a very different direction. We also have a number of habits which are very hard to break. And so we are these creatures of habit. We surround ourselves with people who are generally educationally similar to ourselves, often in the same fields. We typically socialize with people who are in our neighborhood, often with connections through family or through sport. And so the diversity of thought and having people who are from fundamentally different sectors is often one of those things. As we get older and as we get further into our career, we isolate ourselves from people who can really shift our thinking and reimagine the future. At the overload, we know that every day is becoming faster. We feel like the day is extending, the technology never stops. But actually, our attention deficit to actually following the big themes is also holding us back. The responsibility about consequences, and I think the most obvious one around this is around climate change, where people are disconnecting and disattaching themselves from the future consequences, particularly of future generations. And it's almost that idea that if we can't see it, experience it, feel it now, we are going to hold on to what we hold to be true or our values for today without the consequences of tomorrow. And then also this idea of targets. So much of what we do in business has got a target which actually is determined by a financial success. And often the reinvestment or investment into long-term projects, the return is much slower, much longer, and actually would take a significant amount of work to get there. And so how do we make sure we're not just putting in what we know is very easy measurable targets and actually focusing on the ones that really matter long-term? I won't go too much detail here, but some of the themes around what we're experiencing now between now and the next few years, we will talk about a little bit more in this presentation. But a lot of them are driven by artificial intelligence. We are certainly thinking about the computer processing and capability of quantum computing as it becomes the capacity of computers to do more things. We'll be talking about blockchain. We'll be talking about different ways of thinking about the climate. But the changes are already happening, and we need to make sure that within your organizations that you are effectively planning for change and preparing for it by making sure the information that you are getting is actually best in class and actually at the very front of best practice. If we look at some of the other shifts that are along these technological frontiers right now, I think these are the key ones within the infrastructure sector you should be thinking about. Advanced industrial robots are fairly self-explanatory. We need to be thinking about how do we run our organizations so they are safe, that the people who work within them are safe and they've got the capability of the job, that we can remain competitive in the global market. We need to be thinking about how do we work on a 24-hour time frame so that we can actually get more, so we don't end up with these manufacturing delays or actually the inability to fulfill orders. The networks, I think this is the one that you probably need to think about the most at the immediate time. The mesh networks, the decentralization of so many things, including infrastructure, moving away from many of these centralized systems which have actually proven to be, in some cases, non-responsive, very difficult to shift, to decentralized, and actually thinking about all the elements of infrastructure and how many of them would be better served at a community level or a city level or a town level, and thinking about what is the system that enables people to have flexibility so that we can start testing and trialing other types of practices or other methodologies that actually moves us away from a one-size-fits-all. You'll see very shortly the rise of IoT and sensors, and actually being the biggest area of growth within the infrastructure sector. And actually that goes very broad, from these advanced cyber, physical and biological sensors that can give you some really amazing live readings of what works. I'm sure you'll hear plenty about digital twins over these few days, but most importantly, the high value of real-time data. And actually what data is going to do to help you inform your decisions. So there's a lot less of what we did before as the mechanism to plan for the future, but actually having that information, particularly combined with machine learning and artificial intelligence. Some of these other areas are definitely emerging and will have impact on infrastructure, particularly things like renewable living, where more people are choosing to move away from some of the constraints of cities and thinking about living differently. And we'll broach on some of those topics as I go through over the next little while. Just for clarity, artificial intelligence, it's really important you understand the difference between the different types of artificial intelligence. And we have layers within it, between machine learning, and then we have a whole raft of technologies and different ways of using AI. So the two key areas are the narrow tasks that it can perform, and that can be a function. A good example here is detecting credit card fraud, where it does one thing really well, and that's all it does. And then we have these emerging benefits, which are around this really harnessing machine learning and predicting future scenarios. And actually, so it's looking backwards to plan forward. But this idea that the better information AI has, the better you're going to have an understanding of the future that's not biased by human thinking or by our own perception of what reality is. And so within infrastructure, there are two different ways of looking at it here, two very similar charts, but some of the key benefits you'll see on the left around cost overruns, generative design, mitigating risks. Risk is obviously a huge part of infrastructure in your planning and health and safety. But one of the ones I want to pull out here is labour shortages. And at the moment, where every sector is feeling the pinch and we just can't find people, artificial intelligence has actually got the benefit of replacing some of the key capabilities and actually giving better systems so that we can actually build with robustness in our businesses and not be so volatile in terms of having the right talent at the right time at the right level. The Internet of Things, and I'm sure that most of you are well immersed into this space right now with sensors, and now that we can put sensors in almost everything and have these real-time live dashboards, some of the key areas you'll be looking at your remote asset monitoring and automations and looking at things like fleet management and all of your resources. But this particular area is going to be where you need to be spending significant time in terms of talent development, hardware understanding, but also the data that comes from it. So when we think about big data, the way you look at it is you have a collection point, which would generally come from some form of IoT connection. Then all that information gets ingested together in its different formats. The data is then prepared. The computation happens, it brings out and does the analysis that you might be looking for, finds the outliers, finds some trends, can give you the information you need. And then after that computation has happened, it moves into presentation, which often comes through a dashboard type of view. And so you work your way through this process with data that gives you at the other end absolute certainty of where you need to be going. So not just in a general direction, but actually the path to success. Now I'm just going to flick through these, and actually there are a number of ways you can look at big data in a number of ways. This is an AWS looking at the way that they think about data pipelines. You can use Azure, and you may be using this as an option, or likewise Google Cloud. There are multiple different ways where you think about the information coming through in the cloud, preparing the information, sending it out and out through to your environment. I just want to pull out one example with Arup's Neuron. So here's an example within a smart building sector, and they have developed an AI technology that can be utilized. And just thinking about, there are these off-the-shelf types of solutions that actually can be built and integrated into your system so that you're not having to start this on your own. And you go out to the marketplace, you'll see more and more startups playing in this space as well. But just one example of how if you have a dashboard and really good information coming from your assets, particularly smart buildings, then actually you're going to have those insights that will give you a leverage over others. Blockchain, again, a huge amount of activity going across in blockchain. You'll see here in the boxes just some of the brands that are utilizing in multiple different ways, but it's moving far away from just cryptocurrencies, the smart contracts. The commercial real estate industries are really underpinned by it now. Anything where you actually want to make sure you've got a immutable or absolute certainty that actually supply chains, anything around quality assurance, it could be even around your staffing and how you look at staff. Thinking about how blockchain might help you is going to be absolutely essential. And again, how do you make sure you have the capability for people to understand what blockchain is and how it's going to help you in your decision making? So how big are these markets? So if you look at this report about technology and innovation, which has just recently come out, you'll see the big win here. IoT in 2018 was just a $130 billion industry. Within a couple of years, it's going to be a $1.5 trillion industry. You'll start to see across the areas where this is going to be the shaping of infrastructure going forward. But likewise, you'll start to see some of the other growth areas, which include, some of the robotics and solar, for example, artificial intelligence, 5G, and blockchain. So, but IoT, as I mentioned, is really going to be the one thing that is going to give you that visibility and guarantee your understanding of what works and what doesn't. However, the future will not take care of itself. And so I just want to talk about Aotearoa and actually thinking about our responsibilities. So we know, and you'll be familiar with this report that came out of the Infrastructure Commission, and I'm sure someone's probably talking about it in this event very recently in September. What we talk about, these key areas and some of the biggest challenges that we have right now, what we are missing is capability. Because actually one of the key areas is if we don't have the people who know this, we are really going to be caught out. We know right now we have a barrier through the border, but it's far bigger than that. So within the OECD, we have the lowest participation in professional development. We also have the lowest number of people who go into postgraduate studies. And actually, if you think about it, the intent of going into postgraduate studies is to research and develop new knowledge. And if we don't have that as a part of our culture, and that learning is not integrated into every role and experience, then we have a void of new talent coming through, and we're relying on people to trade on dated information. So when we think about the types of skills going forward, these are entirely different roles, all that fit within infrastructure. And so we're going to have to start to think about, how do we find these people? Where are these people going to come from? Because if you look across the likes of a Seek or a Trade Me jobs at the moment, you'll find the array of technical roles from integration right through to big tech, right into robotics, just so domineering and so much bigger in terms of the number of roles that require digital or hard tech skills, certainly far in excess of all others. But what happens here in Aotearoa? We're a changing nation, a very different place where, for those of you who are born here, we grew up in. So by the year 2040, we will be 6 million, I think probably a little higher than this. And also the number of people over 65 is going to double. Now, I'll talk about that a little bit, but the longevity of life is really changing. So right now we are reasonably young, average age is just around to 28, 29, but we're actually going to become older and older, but we will still have a young Māori, Pacific and Asian communities. And so we're going to have quite a significant difference in the makeup, and you'll hear more about this afternoon. And so, but 52% of the population will be non-Pākehā. And so in a very short time, the demographics, we need to make sure that we have diversity in our decision making. We need to make sure in our boards, our executives and our teams, and making sure that we understand the perceptions and perspectives of our entire community. So just a little bit more information about the top graph shows 2021, the demographics, the number of people in these different ethnicities, and then you'll see in the one below in 2043, the growth of the different groups. And so we need to keep track of this and understand the demographic shifts. But again, I know you're going to hear more about this afternoon, so I won't go any further. Population of cities. Here in Tamaki Makaurau in Auckland, we are certainly seeing some big growth and predicted growth that may go certainly above that 2.5 million people. what does that look like? How do we support them? How do we find the housing and support and all the infrastructure that we need? And so these are big growth from what was really a fairly static city size for a long, long time. So one of the things that I'm most passionate about is this idea of desynchronized societies. The fact that we now have in a generation of Gen Z, the most populous grouping in the world, nearly 2.8 billion of them under the age of 24, 7 to 24, and they are living in a very different way. Desynchronized because they do some of the things that we know to be familiar. They get up in the morning, sometime later in the day, potentially eat at different times, consume media at different times, socialize with friends at different times. They prioritize different things. So they are still acting in many ways the way we did, but at different timeframes, different priorities, different weighting, and certainly things like housing ownership is being challenged in every way, including things like driving cars and actually having assets. And we're seeing another breakdown across the communities around these traditionalists, progressives, and visionaries about how they want to work, where they want to work. And so the visionaries on the right-hand side are often global citizens. They work anywhere in the world. They can work from any place in the world, and they're really happy just to come and go and sort of be global nomads. The progressives, what most of us would probably classify as happy to work from home in a hybrid world, distributed workplaces, and actually work as we can comfortably in different locations. And then the more traditionalists who like to come into the office. Now, of course, this doesn't take into consideration people who work in the field, but we are seeing very large numbers of people moving away from that traditional view into progressives and visionaries, which means the idea of cities is going to change, and also into our provincial regions. And if you think about some of these key changes across in Australia, some of the post-COVID, this is last year, occupancy rates, you'll see in Melbourne with some really harsh lockdowns, and again in Sydney, their return to office occupancy was very low. And actually a lot of this occupancy is now going to shift. We have to keep our eye on the ball and think about what is this going to mean for infrastructure as we think about the movement of people across cities and regions. Many of you will have heard recently the Great Resignation. It was started off in the US. We certainly are hearing it right across the world. The largest number of people mid-career who are choosing to focus on something new. The one thing that they're asking the most is they want to have professional development. The one thing more important, even than salary in many cases, is the ability for an employer to invest in them and have them so that they are future-proofed in their individual right to be able to keep working into the future and not to keep trading on what they know. And so this is going to have a consequence for us with a 3.5% unemployment rate. We're already seeing this movement of people into different jobs, thinking about impact and meaning, but also this idea that people want to understand the world that's evolving and emerging in front of them and their disconnect from it, and making sure that as professionals, particularly, they need to be able to step into the space. And so this is a space that I'm particularly passionate about. I have significant numbers of mature students. The average age of our postgrad students here is, we certainly have students in their 60s who are really thinking about a long-term career, much further than the traditional up to 65. So when we think about distributed workforces, I won't go through all of these, but these are some of the considerations. We have to think about multi-time zones and regional booms, and the potential of things like 4-day working weeks as people start challenging the system of always on technology all the time, and thinking about that balance of both mental health but also enjoyment of life and making sure that they can thrive at the work that they do. So we're going to see some really big disruption happening here, which of course has the flow over effect of how people move and mobility and ownership and housing and roads and water and everything else that goes with that. So we have to be very sure of our understanding of some of these shifts. The people who are now having children, if you have a child in the last year, the chances are they will live to be over 100. And you'll again hear more of this, the demographic shift that we gain another 3 months every year. So if every year that we live, we gain three more months, and of course that just keeps extending out. So this idea of thinking about 65 for retirement becomes a little out of place when you start thinking about a life that goes well into your 90s or potentially into the hundreds. And so we have to think about this longevity and our aging population and what will they need, because we are certainly, like most of the Western world, going to really struggle with the needs of an aging population. So very quick fire, some things about New Zealand which do hold us back. One of the ones here I want to really pull out is actually one of these key areas is our economic complexity capture, which is how original is the work that we're doing, how much of the stuff we're doing has original IP, how much of it is protected. And you'll see here on the black line, New Zealand over time has really lacked innovation. We're not doing the same things. We're not reaching out there and saying, let's create new and innovative products and solutions. And we are responding more about becoming consumers. So a big one we need to focus on. Second one, we have got lack capital. So our capital intensity is very much of an issue. And so against other markets and key markets that we play against, we need to make sure we're investing in our people, but we're also investing in the capital that's needed for people to do their jobs. That's the technology they need, the access to the right resources, and potentially in funding. We also work longer than most countries, and so this has an impact as well. So the productivity issues, our ability to actually move ahead when we're working really hard, doing what we do with not enough people. And I think most companies would say they probably are, 5%, maybe even 10% under-resourced in terms of capability, just because of vacancies they can't fill with the right people. Productivity slowing, I think, is a common theme you'll start to see here. So this is not to sort of bag New Zealand for not doing things well. It's really saying, why not? What is it that we're not seeing? What is it we're not investing in ourselves to understand what needs to be done for us to actually thrive going forward, particularly in a COVID recovery period? And so thinking about our labour productivity, what is it we're doing that's not as strong, and where's the lack of investment impacting on us? And then if we think about our largest firms, we know the largest employer is the government, which is a kind of a process of having a small advanced economy with a small population. Lots of people, 97% of people work in their own business or in a small business with under 20 people. But if you start looking across, we still have a real dominance of overseas and internationally owned businesses, and making sure that how do we bring the innovation in if sometimes we're part of a global group. I'll just keep flicking through a framework that I think is really valuable, and will certainly make sure people who are interested can get this out to you, about how you think about eliminating, raising, creating and reducing some of the factors in your work, so that you can actually have a framework moving forward and actually be responding to change. And a lot of this is going to come back to people. Who exactly is going to identify the signals of change and be thinking about all the things we need to be doing today so that we can apply them tomorrow. And so having a framework that you can work that through as your strategic planning for the future, having people who are out there looking at those signals of change. And there are multiple different ways of doing this. And so foresight planning is a key part of a lot of people's jobs, but making sure you have 2 or 3 really good people inside your organization who only spend time understanding what is coming next, because there is a lot of information that you can see. And one of the key ones for me I follow is follow the money. Who is investing? Look globally, where's the investment going? Where are the most informed people spending billions of dollars and seeing where the future is going to lie? And then lastly, before we go into Q&A, I just want to talk about first principles thinking, which is a really wonderful way of thinking about the future, so that we don't go back to traditional start with limitations and things we tried before that didn't work, or thinking about more of the same and expecting different outcomes. First principles thinking is a whole philosophy around it. It's a really great framework. Is how do you start with the possibility? Think about all the things that you might need, the possibilities that you could have, map them all out, define and think about an intelligent path to get there. Think about multiple different ways to solve problems and figure out the most effective way with all the resources and access to knowledge that you can. And then look to the future, because in the end, everybody in the session is planning for a future that we may not be here to experience, or to take the cop of not doing it, being bold enough, big enough and thinking strong enough into the future. So our responsibility starts with how do we make sure we have the frameworks to be thinking strong in the future.
Thank you, Frances. We have some questions coming through, and I'll start with the first one that's come through. Seems like people are quite interested with the Great Resignation. And the first question I've got is, mid-career resignations have always been high. Is this being exacerbated or just an ongoing trend?
I think the key thing that people are talking about right now is COVID made people think about their priorities and the way they spend their time. And there is a shift between wanting to go back to an employer in a very traditional sense and expecting people to fight traffic and go into those sort of traditional commutes, and actually having environments where they might walk in for the day and have actually no integration with their staff or their colleagues because they're on calls and other things all day, and then going home fighting the traffic again. So if there's not flexibility, people are just saying, actually, I'm going to just basically pack up my desk and go home and find another job. I think the other one is the cost of living. People are looking to move out of the cities and actually start looking at what do they want for their children, how do they find affordability of life, actually getting that balance of life back in if they can. But I think most importantly, what we've seen more than anything is people are starting to understand the job market is hot. it's a very hot job market, and actually the infrastructure sector is not immune to this. People poaching people, being offered in some cases ridiculously high salaries because of the shortage, and that shortage of talented people is global. So the more technology you know, the more you understand change and shifts in society, the more you can do integrations, the more you can understand the project management across these new ways of thinking and thinking about how does AI and data and IoT work. Those jobs, there are so few people do them, you literally can write your own check, and that is the problem.
So my next question is, where are the key areas that innovate, and how do you make it a systemic thing, i.e. part of BAU, and how to look for and adapt for these innovations?
So research and development in New Zealand, again, is an area we're very weak by comparison. And I was on the board of Callaghan Innovation for a number of years, and we did see, a decline over time of less people putting money aside to really invest in new technology, a new best-in-class, and it doesn't have to be technology. It could be a new polymer. It could be a new way of thinking about energy or waste. We have to carve off in our businesses and hedge our bets about the things that make us money today, but actually making sure we have the resources dedicated permanently to R&D, which is where innovation will shine. Now, I'm not personally a big fan of innovation labs where you get a whole bunch of very like-minded, forward-thinking people together, because you often then miss out the people with the great experience, but also you don't bring in necessarily younger people with different perspectives, and you miss some of the diversity. So I think it has to be a core function within an organization of pulling aside everybody's responsibility for R&D and actually having key projects and metrics against some innovation. But the one thing you can't put with innovation is a financial return in a short time frame. And too often people do that. They want innovations to be the cash cow of the future. And the chances are, maybe 1 in 10 has legs, but you do need that process of constant innovation, or you are going to rely increasingly on other people's products and services for your business to grow.
My own personal question, but when we were talking before, we're talking about how countries like New Zealand are technology takers. A lot of the innovation is coming from overseas. What does that mean for how New Zealand might have to think about how they adopt technology?
Yeah, I think this part about being a technology taker has been a trend over the last 20 years as our innovation rankings have declined. And it's one of those things, we get excited about the sort of the sizzle and the shiny thing, and we want to bring it in. And we often don't think about being fit for purpose for a smaller economy. And so I think it's really important we understand, if we're going to bring in products from offshore, are they truly fit for purpose? Because just because it works really well in an organization with 10,000 staff or 100,000 people, is it really going to work for a company with 500 people? And so we have a different environment, and we just need to make sure we're testing some of those technology takes in a very much mindful way, thinking, is it truly for this market? And if not, then there is a great problem to solve, and actually find the people who perhaps can work with you to create your own solution, and not be sort of taking off the shelf and then trying to do kind of variations of something off the shelf, which gets incredibly expensive and very unpredictable in nature.
So I've got a next question coming through. Do you foresee it becoming harder to make reasonable assumptions about the future as we are exposed to greater amounts of information and become more overloaded, making it harder to know what information to pay attention to?
I think there's some good points there. Data in its purest form gives you the insights you need in a way that we've never had. We no longer have to kind of think about, is this working or not? We know. But the problem is there is a lot of information out there that will saturate the marketplace, which is not accurate or and sort of information that we can rely upon. So we need to create our own data. I think the most important thing is that data is our future. So we need to make sure that we understand our projects, our customers, our assets, our people, and having that information, that data sets that is actually true to you, because there's no more pure form of data than that. When we start bringing in third-party integrated data, we just need to make sure, again, is it fit for purpose for what we're doing? But the source of truth is always tricky at a time when there's a proliferation of just so much abundance of information. And in fact, every day it just gets bigger and bigger. So we need to be mindful again about where our data sources are coming from.
Really good point. So you mentioned in your talk that it's a good idea to follow the smart money, to see who's investing, where the really smart technology savvy people. The question that we have here is, how can you follow the smart money? Don't those smart investors keep their cards close?
I think to a certain extent, you'll see growth because you'll see it on the stock market in exchange of people where they're investing money, when they're letting go some really big shareholding and investing. I don't think it's that invisible at all. I think for the very early stage, absolutely. But actually, if you just go just beyond that very early stage, you can start to see where you have organizations or individuals who have got massive resources to investigate, explore where they're going to put the next dollar. And they are the ones who you can follow with a fairly high level of sort of safety, that they have put that effort in to understand the implications and opportunities of a new type of technology or software or movement. Now, I think you do need, like I mentioned, is you need a lot of people focusing on foresight and insights, and you need people who are scanning for signals and doing these things for you. There is no single sort of source of truth in that way. You can't just go one place and go, we can just look at one area. And if I think about, for example, finance and the move away from physical money into digital currencies, and then you could think, so you would say, well, there's a whole cryptocurrency lift in the NFTs and the non-fungible tokens, but you also have at the same time the digital yuan being rolled out in China and actually banning cryptocurrency. So you take all these sort of things and you go, okay, and Apple Pay has 500 million users. And so if you think of 8 billion roughly people in the world, they've got a huge truckload of people. So why is it Apple Pay has taken off, but Google Pay not so much? So you start to map out, depending on your sector, what are those insights that are happening? And also the rate at which people are adopting a new technology. So if people are using Apple Pay, but not using Google Pay, but they do love Alipay, but they're moving to digital yuan, follow the money, literally in this case, and actually start to think about what are the behavioral shifts that are enabling that. Is it purely consumer driven? Is there an incentive? Is it the technology? Is it the application? Like physically, is the app work better than another one? Or is it something more sort of tied to investment? And so actually understanding those levers of change, because they are quite complex and they often will come down to a single person. Now, if you had said, I'll give you a really good example, completely away from infrastructure, Singles Day was in China in the last few days. One New Zealand company, Wynn toothpaste, a natural toothpaste, got one influencer in China. He's called the Lipstick King. He spent 115 seconds online talking about Wynn toothpaste and sold 115,000 tubes of toothpaste. Now, if you had told me 5 years ago that one person could sell 115,000 tubes of toothpaste in 2 minutes, I would have said that's impossible. That just doesn't happen. But that happens again and again and again. So the demographic shift with Generation Z, who are coming through and breaking all the rules, they are the circuit breakers of almost every sector. They are changing the way we have to think. And they are now, at the age of 24, at the top of that group, they are in our workforce. And they are wanting and expecting change, whether it be around sustainability and climate, whether it be around the working environment, what projects they get to work on, the impact that they get to have, the decision making. They are going to change things in a very big way, and they're flooding into our sectors.
And in companies and organizations who are talent poor, and if they don't get what they want, they may end up creating their own companies to achieve the outcome they're looking for.
Yep, so true.
So the next question is an interesting one around legislation. Any thoughts about how we deal with the constraints of legislation that might not be based on excellent first principles thinking and a lack of understanding about what's coming? What does the future of government look like given the speed of change required and the standard of thinking required?
It's really interesting. We're starting to see people pushing back against system change. For example, we have what we call DAOs, D-A-O, distributed autonomous organizations, forming and actually saying, we're creating our own set of rules. We're putting it on the blockchain, and we're seeing the splinternet of the internet. So it's splintering off of people saying, I want to be disconnected from the one source of information through the internet, and we're going to do that. And sometimes it's a country, sometimes it's a sort of an undercurrent. This decentralization is happening. So governments around the world are going to have to think about this, because people are fragmenting away. It's not a one party or the other. It's actually subgroups and sub-parties. And this desynchronized society that I was talking about is people are coming at it with the expectation there's a high level of personalization and accountability. So I think what will happen is governments are going to have to start getting their head around that they are not going to hold power in the way they traditionally did, that it's going to be a shared power. And we know that, in many cases, some of the tech giants have a hold of young people in a way that even governments don't have. And there is, if you think about, for example, 2 billion people aren't using Facebook. They have an influence that no government has. So I think there's going to be this sort of softening at the edges, and the sort of the definitive yes or no or black and white, and a lot more and actually understanding and being that flexible spaces, more piloting, more testing, more research and development, and actually understanding how do they move into these spaces safely, and making sure there's not a huge risk, but also moving the dial forward, because if they don't, they're going to polarize an entire generation coming through who will just say, I'm not going to vote, and I'm not going to believe in the system.
It's a tricky set of interacting issues there.
It certainly is.
So the next question is around productivity. What do you think are the barriers to increasing productivity? It sounds like we need to do better education-wise and encouraging more of it.
For me, if I had one wish in the world, would be, somehow I could get a little voice in everybody's ear and just asking them about their readiness and the information that they have to make good decisions for tomorrow. And I think the information absence is holding us back in productivity. We don't know what we don't know. And so some of the things I do when I'm working with companies and boards and executives, I say, if you had to go and apply for your job today, go find that job, and how much of it could you actually do? And it's quite a terrifying process, because suddenly you start realizing that the same type of job today, if they say been in the job for 5 or 10 years, has shifted so significantly. But I think it gets to the point where we need to understand productivity is basically a byproduct of having the right tools and information. And so if we are capital poor and we don't have the right information, we are always going to be on the back foot when it comes to productivity. So for me, it's about saying, if we can get people to understand it's a benefit to actually put yourself into a space where you're having to learn new things, because then you go to the strategic decision-making table with the information that actually informs number of other people about their decision making. We can't expect everyone to do it. Not everyone's going to put their hand up and say, I'm prepared to go back into learning or spend some of my week doing some form of training. But it's imperative that our senior leaders understand their vulnerability and actually how risky it is that they trade on old knowledge for big future decisions. And so I think productivity will come when people start to understand that better.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the questions we've got time for, even though there's more coming through. That was really interesting, and thank you for sharing your insights, Frances.
No, it's a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of the sessions. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Noriko and Frances for that enlightening session that we have. And I'd also like to thank Aurecon for sponsoring that session. Now we're going to move over into the next session to Paul Spoonley, and he's going to talk about demographic change and meeting future challenges. So I encourage you all to join that. Thank you.